Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode number 29 of the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris. Our goal today is to help you lead with a whole heart, a healthy brain, and a soul on fire. I'm so glad you're with us. Today's episode is really special in that we're sharing our last Driven Addictions webinar from July 13th. I'm joined with Dr. Todd Bowman, a psychologist, neuroscientist, author, university professor, expert in addiction recovery, and fellow at Red Ink Revival. In our Red Ink recovery process, we train leaders to support those in the throes of addictive or compulsive behavior, as well as launching a recovery adventure for those who are presently struggling. Be sure to hang on to the end for a special discount at our Driven Addictions Personal Discovery Experience. Personal discovery experiences are 2-hour online events with a group of 6 to 20 peers as we discover the roots that drive individual stories. These training events are designed for those who want to know what drives them, as well as for pastor leaders who want to better equip those that they lead. Our next Driven Addictions experience, specific to the ardent drivers of addiction, is July 20th. Then our next Driven People, Driven Leaders experience, specific to emotional drivers and individuals and teams, are in the coming weeks. The cohort designed for church ministry staff is July the 22nd. The cohort for the general population is August 9th, and the senior pastors cohort will be August the 10th. To find out more, go to redinkrevival.com. But first, if this podcast is adding value to your leadership in life, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to this podcast, like it, and comment in the reviews at iTunes. Also, help us get the word out by sharing on your social media platforms. Thank you for doing that. Go to redinkrevival.com and check out everything we're up to. While you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post, as well as all our upcoming events. Go now to sign up. Let's go now to this week's episode number 29 in our Red Ink Recovery webinar on Driven Addictions.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Camille. I'm with Red Ink Revival, and I am so excited that you all are here today to join us for this webinar. Thank you so much for taking such an incredibly bold step in attending today. I know that this will be such a blessing for your faith and your leadership. As we're waiting just a few minutes for everyone to join our webinar, I do want to let you all know that the Red Ink recovery process does not stop here. We will be having a personal discovery experience coming up. It's next Monday, July 20th at 6 p.m. Central Time. This is a 2-hour group processing experience to really allow you to dig into your story. This is going to be an absolutely incredible experience, and you really don't want to miss it. Ordinarily, this experience is going to be $99, but as one of our webinar attendees, you have an exclusive offer for you, but you have to stay on towards the end to hear how you can get that discount code for our event. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our therapeutic faculty for this webinar today. First off, we have Dr. Todd Bowman. He is an incredible professor among many subjects at different universities such as Indiana Wesleyan University, Nazarene Theological Seminary, and the Nazarene Bible College. He's also a course consultant, an author, an editor, a dad, a husband, an all-around great individual, and we are so excited and so blessed to have him here with us today. We also will be hearing from Patrick Norris. He is a pastor, and he's actually the founder of Red Ink Revival and the curator of this platform. He is also a senior pastor at Life Point Church, and he has been guest speaking for over 35 years, which is insane. We are so excited to have him here today speaking. He's a certified trauma and addiction professional. So he is such a wealth of knowledge, and we are so excited that we have them both here today to help us grow. All right, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you, Patrick.
Sounds great. Thank you, Camille. Well, welcome Everybody, we're so excited that you're with us. We appreciate you being on with us. If you would go ahead and turn your video off, if you would, and then if you would mute, that'll help us kind of have an easier flow of our webinar. But we welcome everybody. So excited that you're here. We want to walk through some things with regard to driven addictions, compulsivity, things that are unwanted in your life, or maybe you have a family member, or maybe you're a pastor leader and you have somebody in your congregation that you would like to be able to be more efficient in the way that you can minister to them and understand the processes that go into who they are and why they do what they do. We do believe that driven people ought to know what they're driven by. And so Red Ink Revival is designed to help people who are in that kind of mystery flow of trying to figure out what is in the engine that's driving them. And so we're creating a recovery revival through the brain, mind, and spirit of a struggler. The word red of Red Ink Revival is all about redemption. And we are grateful that our relationship with Christ sets us up to believe that there's always redemption in the story, that God never wipes his hands of us and says, I'm done, but he actually wants to take us on a recovery adventure. Ink is all about a rewrite. It's the reprogramming of the brain and the heart. Also, revival is about revolution, bringing about this massive transformational change in our lives. And so, again, you may be somebody who right now, as you're thinking about this webinar and attending, you're thinking about people in your life who have struggled with everything from addiction, whether that addiction is related to alcohol, recreational drugs, gambling, spending, emotional eating. You have just a plethora of ways that these engines that are on the inside of a person will express themselves. And again, people can feel very powerless in that process. And so we're real honored today to have my great friend and fellow of Red Ink Revival, Dr. Todd Bowman. Todd, it's awesome that you and I get to do this together today. I'm excited that you have such a heart and passion for people who struggled with addictions. I'm just going to tee you up with that for a second, and then we'll jump into some of these percentages. But why don't you share a minute about your heart for somebody who is struggling in their lives around addiction or compulsivity?
Yeah, absolutely. From a family systems perspective, I've grown up knowing that my grandfather on one side, my father's side, was the first man in 7 generations to not pick up the bottle. But I've also seen the flip side of that, to kind of look at what does healing look like where there's maybe spiritual investment in the church and leadership in the church, but not necessarily emotional growth that backfills that space, and how there's maybe sober living, but not necessarily flourishing. I've also seen on the flip side, on my mom's side of the family, active addictions with sex, with alcohol, with compulsive eating. So my family background is just saturated with struggling with addiction, recovering from addiction, attempting to recover from addiction. So it's been a part of my life, the formative experience that I've had intergenerationally for quite a while back, or quite a ways back in my family of origin. And then kind of out of that, more specifically as a therapist, the work that I do in specializing in problematic sexual behavior, sexual addiction, and then how often that coincides with other behavioral process addictions, as well as chemical dependence or chemical addictions as well. So it's one of those things where I'm not sure I chose this, but rather was called into it. Yeah. And it just is an honor to enter into the stories and the struggles of folks who are trying to find healing, trying to find sobriety, and ultimately trying to find transformation.
I want to kind of put you on a platform as well, because you are a leading expert in the world of addiction recovery, focused on sexual addiction, which one thing we know about addiction is that if you understand one of the processings towards an addictive behavior, you understand them all. It's not like they all have complete uniquenesses. They all fundamentally operate on the same scaling. And so with you, you've created actually the only government recognized accredited university course on sexual addiction. And that puts you in a very rare area of experts. And so I do want to highlight that. And so glad we get to do this together. You're a Jesus lover. That's one of my favorite things about you. And so we're going to have a great time talking through some of these things.
Absolutely.
Well, let's look at these percentages that are on our screen. Our problem with the emotional side of humanity. So when we're looking at these percentages, I just want us to highlight the reality that we have some real problems that are below the surface that ultimately drive so much of what's in our lives. 50% of entrepreneurs and executives report having mental health issues. That's amazing. That's 1 out of every 2 that we meet. 95% of startup dreams fall short of projections, inflating this emotional stress. And that emotional stress is going to try to find its way through behaviors. 45% live in ongoing worry or stress. And when that worry or stress is not processed or mitigated, again, it's going to find its way through the cracks of our personality. 50% have a history of depression. These are executives. 70% of pastors, they report having a lower self-image now than when they first started. Well, we know that can't continue and not show up in physical bodies, wearing out, sickness, disease, pain, and then of course you have these kind of emotional and maladaptive behaviors that come from it. 48% of entrepreneurs and executives get a divorce from stress-induced emotional states. And 84% of pastors wish they had somebody that they could trust and confide in, and yet they don't have any. Let me hit this next slide, and then Todd, I'd like for you to give some thoughts. In fact, if you want to interrupt me along these numbers, you can. 69% of people feel unappreciated at work, and it's affected their emotional states. 48% of the population are workaholics, which is an addictive quality. It's an addictive expression. 80% report having significant anger and aggression issues. 10% struggle with alcohol and drug addictions. 10% of the population struggle with various sexual addictions, though you and I both know when we look inside church organizations, Dr. Ted Roberts has reported that in his own self-surveys that he's done in large church environment with men, that it can be up to 70%, 70%, 7 out of 10 struggle. 6% of people report a shopping addiction, 27% manage stress through emotional eating, overeating, and skipping meals. So you're in the everyday, you're living in the midst of these percentages. Would you say your experience is similar to this? Are there any of the numbers you'd say, well, in my practice, some of these are actually a lot more than what's reported here?
Yeah, just a jumping off point with a couple of these. I think that the point you made about workaholism, that's probably the quiet killer in our culture. The stress that folks are carrying in the midst of that 55 to 75 hour work week. I'll tell you a story. I took my kids to McDonald's. It's probably been a number of years ago. And there was the Monopoly game at McDonald's was going on, which I loved as a child, which should come as no surprise, right? Because like in my addicted family system experience, I always thought the next time we went to McDonald's, we were going to get the boardwalk and win the $1 million. If you've been around for our driven finances conversations, that'll probably make a lot of sense to you. But we walked in and there was this sign that said, win $1 million, quit your second job. And I thought, oh my, like if that's the current state of affairs in Western culture, that becoming a millionaire only affords you the opportunity to quit your second job, then are our priorities quite askew. So I think this workaholism is an interesting dimension for us to think about with regard to, if I can paraphrase Pat Carnes' definition for addiction, it's a pathological relationship with a mood-altering experience. It's something undesirable that serves a function for us, that helps us escape a part of our reality that we dislike. It's dysphoric, it's anxiety inducing. And work can do that. Even though work can be the thing that creates the stress, if we work to feel a sense of control, if we work to try and get ahead in some way, like we don't do things neurophysiologically that don't serve a function. Even if those things are maladaptive, even the problematic things that we do because they serve a function. Work is one of those interesting spaces where we can do that thing to an addictive level, even though that's the thing we're trying to escape from. And oftentimes as I'm working with folks who use work as an escape, right? They find that there's again that pathological relationship. I wish I could work less, but I can't. I've obligated myself financially, or I don't know what I would do, or I wish I didn't work this much, but I can't help myself. So there's an interesting revealing dynamic with workaholism that I think predisposes us. We know that addictions show up in our lives in 3s and 4s. It's not like you have an isolated addictive experience. If you've got one addiction, you've probably got 3 or 4 addictions.
And what you mean by that is, first of all, they're breeding in that space, but also if you put a lid on one of them, they will bust out and have new addictive behaviors that'll show up.
Yeah, and there's some great neuro research by Koob and others in the last 10, 15 years that demonstrates the point you made earlier. Addiction is addiction is addiction. It doesn't matter if we're talking about amphetamines or opiates or online behavior or gambling. Like neurochemically, the brain is the great leveler of the playing field. And with regard to the process of neurochemically addictions, it's all the same. Now we can look at different chemicals, how different chemicals amplify things, because with gambling, with shopping, with sex addiction, the brain is never going to create an endogenous experience, an organic internal experience that can kill the body. It has to be ingested, inhaled, or injected in some way. That's going to be an external, exogenous type of chemical. Amphetamines, opiates, narcotics, broadly defined, alcohol, etc. But neurochemically, like what's happening, addiction is addiction is addiction. If it's chemical or process, what we're talking about, the differences being, is the intensity of impact that can happen with something that's ingested, injected, or inhaled, as well as kind of the secondary dynamics, the kind of collateral impact to the body. The half-life of the chemical comes into play, a number of other things with how our physiology is processing that chemical out of our bodies. Yeah. But addiction is addiction when it comes to the brain.
And so, because you, again, are so invested in helping people recover, and you have hundreds of case studies that you are working with clients that are, either have come through recovery or they're in right now process to that sobriety, you know that many people come into your office and they've tried everything. They've read books, they got the motivational stuff, some in spiritual context, tried to fast it away, some have had devils cast out of them, some have had these dynamic, super, miracle, inner healing kind of sessions, and yet they've never been able to be free. And free here is not that you're not tempted, it's that you have the manageable power to be able to resist the temptation. And when they're in that state of, I can't get out of this, what are some of the hope points that you can give them to help them believe that, no matter how hard that they've tried, how much they've prayed and how much Bible they've read, or 15 other options, maybe they went to 15 therapists, because not every therapist has been trained or is equipped to be able to handle this. So how do you give those people hope?
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of what Paul writes about in his epistle to the church in Rome, specifically in Romans 7. We all know this kind of internal dialogue, the battle that's there. Maybe it's hyperbole, maybe it's legitimate expression from Paul. I don't think it really matters, quite frankly. I think what's interesting is this idea of the one's parts not integrating, right? Like that we keep doing something that we don't want to do. So our behavior and our will are disconnected. And somewhere in that, I think our emotions have gone askew too. If we look through this list, right, we're talking about being unappreciated, emotional eating, depression, anxiety, panic, a number of things. So this internal working model, this kind of way that we're designed for the parts of us to harmonize and operate congruently, when that gets turned askew by life experience, that's where we really see the origins of addiction, most specifically when there's interpersonal kinds of wounds, abandonment, neglect, physical abuse, verbal abuse, spiritual abuse comes to mind. And it's that woundedness in relationship that typically gets compounded over time. And then we're back with the definition of addiction that we started with, a pathological relationship with a mood-altering behavior. Well, I think what's interesting in that, we've all experienced that dynamic to some degree that Paul writes about. Like, why do I keep doing this thing that I don't want to do? Like, I dislike it. I strongly, vehemently desire for a different experience, but I keep doing it. Well, it gets back to functionality. You know, in most of those stories that you're talking about where folks stay stuck in a behavior, it's because neurophysiologically or psychologically or probably a combination thereof, the behavior serves the function in the best way, the most effective way, in spite of the person's desire, in spite of their belief system, in spite of their morality, in spite of their love for Christ. Like, their body has been conditioned specifically to serve the primary function of helping them navigate the distress of anxiety, the distress of depression, the distress of panic, the distress of painful relationship, the distress of trauma that's been carried. I love where that chapter ends, where it says, "Who will save me from this body of death?" Right, and I think we have a propensity to, if you'll let me assume this, to over spiritualize.
Yes.
Because I think the answer is spot on, right? Like, thanks be to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. But I think before we get to that place, right? Like, I think the question that's asked there is quite telling, that it's a who, right? So many of these wounds that we're talking about happen in relationship, or they're wounds that occur that relationship wasn't attuned to, and those wounds aren't resolved healthily. And we're left damaged. We're left bleeding out emotionally. We're left fractured. And then something impersonal, like a chemical compound, something on a television screen or a movie screen or a cell phone screen, all of a sudden begins to medicate us neurochemically. Or even worse, we find acceptance with a group of people who are using that substance to self-medicate. And then we have belonging and acceptance that we were looking for that gets interwoven with the medicating impact of whatever the substance is. So then we've got a double whammy where there's relational feedback and neurophysiological feedback in the chemical that's kind of layering, like, well, I have to use to get acceptance. And we're just upping the probability that addiction is going to take root in that circumstance. But it's a who, right? Like, that we're wounded in relationship, and it's that we're called to be healed in healthy relationship. And I think that's where, if we had time, and we will in the future, tease apart what's the function of a 12-step group. Well, it serves this really powerful function of providing corrective experiences for all the places that we've been wounded in relationship. It's a place of support. It's a place of having truth spoken into us. It's a place of healthy and appropriate challenge. It's a place of healthy boundaries that exist between people. In short, it's a place where we're called to have these parts of us that have been kind of rendered disconnected or torn asunder by painful life experience, all of a sudden slowly and intentionally be put back together. And let's not forget that the original 12-step model was very Christocentric. It was rooted in biblical literature and in a theological framework, a little bit less as that has evolved over time. But even with the 12 steps, we're looking at something that served the function of taking the brokenness of our experience and how it's shown up in addiction and fostering this sense of reintegration and reconnecting all the parts back into a whole.
So when you say, as an example, that physiologically or in our bodies, we're designed so that we're in distress, our brain is looking for something to calm the distress. And sometimes it will look for things that will give an immediate neurochemical that calms, but it actually, in the long run, can create more distress, like an addictive behavior. So as an example, if a person is in distress and they're desiring, they don't even consciously know it, but they're desiring a dopamine hit to make them feel better in the distress. And in that space, they will reach out for alcohol, or to get drunk, or to take a hit of some kind of drug, or sexually looking at porn, or for some that have crossed other boundaries because of the traumas in them, they go to a massage parlor, or they go to a hookup site. And there's a lot of connection of their behavior to their brains trying to find neurochemicals to calm their distress, or to make them feel like that they are going to be okay. And that's how you're describing all this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the book that we'll use, kind of the paradigm that we'll use for the personal discovery experience is by Richard J. Flores. It's called Addiction as Attachment Disorder. And we'll really get into, to your point here, how when there's rupture interpersonally, specifically with primary attachment figures, and our wounds aren't healed, our pains aren't comforted, our sadness is not met with presence, our anxieties are not assuaged, our bodies tend to carry this distress until we find something that soothes us.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And then it's not a stretch to say, like, if that interpersonal environment is inconsistent, or even worse, like is intrusive, meaning there's neglect or physical abuse or emotional abuse, sexual abuse in that space, like we will attach to things that provide some level of soothing for us. And that's what I mean when I say it serves a function more intensely than anything else.
Yeah.
And then the bonding is with the experience. The bonding is sometimes, again, with the people. Even though I don't desire to do the thing, the bonding is because the thing, the substance, the experience, the process serves the function because of what it's done for us more powerfully than anything else.
Yeah. And it is, we look at all these percentages, and it is a very common thing. And I don't know why within Christianity as a whole, there's this idea that if you struggle with something, you're bad. When the whole idea of Christianity is that you will be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Transformed, you're continually growing, you're continually morphing into what Christ desires for you, which means then somebody who struggled at something somewhere in their life, that should be looked at as normal, not abnormal. It's normal that you start in brokenness, and it is a lifetime process from faith to faith and glory to glory that we are actually being formed into the image of Christ. And nowhere in the Bible, nowhere did Jesus or any of the apostles, nowhere does there become a presentation that God's expectation is perfection and flawlessness. Yet that is the religious circles in church settings and in religious groups. That is where we get these messages that I can't let anybody know that I'm in pain, or that I'm struggling, or that I have created neural pathways that have developed and galvanized these instincts towards managing my distress with an addictive behavior. I can't let anybody know that. Well, why couldn't you? This is normal. Everything that the Bible talks about with growth or development or you becoming like Christ, all of that is inherent within those ideas. So one of the things that we have to consider is that when somebody's struggling in addiction, there are consequences that often that they haven't slowed down to actually think about. And when I say they, I'm talking about that as a leader looking at somebody who's struggling. But then those who struggle, is so important that they actually can soberly look at what they've had consequences of, the time they've lost, the relationships they've injured. Because the people in their life, not just from the behavior itself and the loved ones finding out about it, but because of the addiction, there is usually a heightened level of cortisol in the amygdala, which means that there's a lot of raging going on, which means then the irritation, agitation, and anger that is resident within the person who struggles that they walk into their house and their husband or wife just simply says something, off the wall or even challenges them and they blow up. There is a sword injury that rips right into their kids, and their kids are kids. But it's important that people recognize their consequences, the amount of money that's been wasted, and genuinely the dreams that have been sabotaged. So first, let's talk to the person who's struggling and how important is it for them to actually see, if I don't really begin to move towards health and wholeheartedness around this, I'm actually going to lose so much in my life, even more than what I've already lost. How important is that?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind, and you and I were talking about this a bit earlier, Dan Siegel's idea of name it to tame it. When it comes to consequences, we just have to get rigorously honest with ourselves about what has the cost of this been. You've mentioned a few of these here, and I think these are a great essential quadrant of 4 consequences to look at. We've got to get honest. How much time has been lost at work? How much revenue has been wasted or lost? How many experiences, not just time, but especially in this coronavirus shutdown, as people are mourning the loss of graduation, the loss of their senior year of softball or their senior year of soccer or their senior year of baseball, right? Like there's people navigating lost time, not of their own choosing. And here, one of the consequences that we see with addiction is time lost trying to obtain the substance, or of acting out with the substance, or recovering from the use of the substance, of covering their tracks as they're sobering up, or as they're getting over a hangover, whatever. I would say that consequences really are the catalyst for change. And maybe this speaks to both groups that you asked about, both the individual struggling as well as an individual in leadership. And that's that consequences are the catalyst for change. And I think sometimes in the church, we try and create these soft landing spaces. And I think that's a noble intention. And yet I wonder if we sometimes undercut the process of consequences serving as a primary catalyst for the growth and healing that you were also talking about a second ago.
Yeah.
That we have to have a growth-oriented mindset and not expect perfection. In fact, the AA, NA adages would say something along the lines of process over perfection. If as a church, both as a struggler and as a leader, we can really be gracious with that idea of process over perfection, it means that, guess what? Process happens, development happens as a series of crises. Process happens as a series of developmental crises.
Yeah.
And I think this idea of consequences being the catalyst for change is at the heart of that. There is crisis in rock bottom. There's crisis in taking stock of the relationships that have been wounded. I mean, the 12 steps talk about making amends, right? Like once you're a little ways into the 12 steps, right? Recognizing there's been injury that's happened. I need to rectify these wrongs. And sometimes I think, especially more in our current church culture, and don't get me wrong, there's been plenty of rigidity and probably spiritual abuse in that rigidity in the history of the church. But we're in a season right now in Christianity in the West where we're almost so grace-based that we undercut the function of these critical moments of consequence in the lives of the struggler.
That's powerful.
And I think that we need to learn how to love. I mean, I think about in John chapter 8, the woman who's brought before Christ to be stoned. Like he doesn't meet her at the door and give her a robe to protect her modesty. He could have. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. But like he allows this experience to play out so that the totality of the community can be brought face to face with their struggles. Not just the woman caught in adultery, but these men with stones in their hands who have been objectifying and lustfully gazing upon her. Right? Like he allows the consequences to amplify so that she's receptive to this critical moment of change. And what's interesting is when in Romans chapter 7, Paul talks about who will save us, who will rescue us from this body of death. We see it lived out in John chapter 8, where he says, has no one condemned you? And she says, no one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin. It's kind of a paradox, isn't it? Right? Like that obviously relationship is the answer. Relationship with him in particular is the answer for this woman. And she feels it and is noticing that he's looking at her differently than all these other men. is attuned to her in a fundamentally different way. Relationship is fundamentally corrective and restorative in the right moment when those consequences have peaked. And there's a recognition that something different is necessary.
Yeah.
But the paradox is he sends her away. Go now and leave your life of sin. A, meaning it's possible to live above the life of sin that she's been ensnared in. But B, like, go? Like, her desire is to stay, right? She can't live in this new reality of not sinning in the way she has without taking a piece of him. We would call that an internal working model, which is why in the context of addiction recovery, interpersonal experiencing is so critical. That's why good therapists are so critical. That's why having a good sponsor is so critical. That's why being a part of a healthy group, either CR or SA or NA or SA or SLAA, whatever fellowship one is a part of, it's why it's so critical. And pastors, if I can just drop some truth on you, you've got to get over yourselves. Like, you can't do it all.
Yeah.
Your people need groups. And if you don't have a CR fellowship in your church, it's time to start one. If they go down to the Baptist church or the Methodist church or the Wesleyan church or wherever church, because they've got a CR group on Thursday nights, encourage that or start one.
And we are developing those at Red Ink. Red Ink, we are creating some groups, because it's not just getting together with Bubba and John or Sue and Sally. It's getting together with a group of people that have the right training, right language to begin to develop the integration of those ideas into the relational environment, and which is so critical. Well, one of the things that happens in my experience, particularly with spouses, someone struggling in addiction, is that the spouse will come to the struggling person, the partner, and surround them to rescue them. And the consistent rescuing of that person puts the partner who isn't struggling, the partner who isn't in the throes of an addiction, they get angry and they're like, why isn't it that they have more motivation? Why don't they do something about this? And immediately they separate themselves from this idea that they have a problem as the faithful partner, but their betraying partner does not have a problem. And they're like, what do you mean they don't have a problem? They're the ones in the addiction. Yeah, but because you've rescued them, they don't have a problem. It's not until you create boundaries, differentiation, and you say to them, look, here's going to be the consequences if you don't start dealing with your stuff. You're not going to be able to live here. You're not going to be able to have some of the resourcing that you've had before. We're going to have to make some hard decisions. And it may put me as the faithful partner into a difficult scenario immediately, but in the long run, it's going to cause me to go on a trajectory towards wholeheartedness. But my spouse does not have the impetus, the motivation, because they don't have a problem. Most of the time when they're being rescued by their partner, they don't see that they have a problem. And the faithful partner is like, I'm mad because you won't do something about this. And they're like, why do I got to do anything about it? Life's good for me. You keep rescuing me.
You know, and it makes me wonder. I mean, I've often said that, you know, in its distress, the church operates an awful lot like an addicted family system. And, you know, I'm just kind of sitting here reflecting, Patrick, on the stories that I've heard in my office where a healthy spouse was protesting appropriately, and the enabling partner in the equation was the pastoral counsel they received from someone on staff. And the codependency that the partner presents with is really shifted onto him or her by way of the pastoral counsel they received. And all of a sudden, this system where, and it will just say a male addict and a female partner, where the husband's addiction was appropriately protested, and they go and see the pastor, and the enabling that happens there. Oh, Jerry's a great guy. Like, I'm sure that he might be drinking a bit much, but he's a deacon, you know, he's on the board, he's in leadership, you know, like, let's just gather some data and see, you know, is this really a problem? You know, all of a sudden, right, like there's been this codependent enabling from a pastor into a system, right? And she might protest that. A, it's a form of spiritual abuse, but B, she might protest that, but probably not. And what's she going to do? She's probably going to think that she's the one who's wrong, do some rescuing. Then all of a sudden, she's in that position that you just described by way of the well-intended pastoral counsel that's been received.
Yeah. Oh, it's That's good.
And I think it's when I say the church operates like an addicted family system, like sometimes the church is the enabler in the addicted family system.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sometimes it's the lost child, and we just don't speak to the issues of addiction from the pulpit, or we don't have a CR fellowship, or if we do, right, like it's unpublished and you have to have a secret password to gain access to it, which makes it seem like, to your previous point, you know, struggling with anything is like this dirty secret that only 5% of the church has to deal with. And like, they're going to meet on some undisclosed night in some undisclosed place. And there's not room for us to be real about the struggles that we carry.
Wow, that's so good. Well, you know, a lot of our folks who are on or who will watch this webinar at another time may be asking the question, you know, what are they driven by? What am I driven by? And so we ask it, what are you driven by? And we have this modeling at Red Ink Revival that is theological, psychological, and neurobiological. Theologically, or in relationship with Jesus, often what happens within Christian circles is you'll have behaviorism, or let's just try to get people to discipline themselves into the right behaviors. And we understand that all human behavior is systemic. It all begins biblically in the heart, moves through these heart emotional beliefs that are not just these mental assenting beliefs. They're not just cognitive, I aspire to believe, but they are the deep embedded emotional beliefs that generally have happened to a person over an entire lifetime. That then spawns to the surface all of these ruminating thoughts, or thoughts that you can grab onto and obsess on, and then they will turn into an inflamed emotion that ultimately bring about a behavior. So often when people think, well, what you need to do is just repent. If you'll just repent of your sin, then all of a sudden things will get better. Reality is that there is much more going on below the surface than just a choice point. And so in theology, we begin with the heart. Jesus says that out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, and so on. Proverbs says to guard the heart with all diligence. Out of it flows the issues of life. So the heart is the epicenter of all behavior. Until things are dealt with at a heart level, all you're doing is masking. All you're doing is creating some kind of armor that presents yourself as though you're not struggling when internally you know you are. Heart beliefs would be where Jesus would talk about believing with the heart. The designation means that it's not just the cognitive belief or aspired belief, it is something that you believe in the heart. We read in Proverbs that as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So thoughts actually originate in the heart. They seep through these emotional beliefs into your thinking processes. And then when you latch on to them emotionally, think about them, they inflame you until you're driven to a behavior. Well, then we move into psychology and neurobiology, and we have these parallel statements: heart, identity, self in the psychology. The same thing in neurobiology, or the brain is about the lower brain, the brain stem and the limbic system. And then we move each one line by line across. Trauma-formed beliefs would be the same as heart beliefs. This would be the fear-love circuits. Thoughts and feelings would actually be consistent with cognitive processing, which would be in the brain, neurons firing off, neurons that fire together, wire together, then they release neurochemicals that cause you then to have a compulsion towards a behavior. So if you would, and I just want everybody to know that Dr. Bowman is also a neuroscientist. He studies the brain in all the different aspects of human behavior and addiction models that we would talk about. So walk us through some of this. Help us understand this when we think of theology, psychology, and neurobiology, and how they all actually overlap each other and are consistent.
Yeah, that's one of my kind of favorite pastimes, is to explore the literature, to look at these really distinct points of convergence. And I think this model does a great job of holding together that reality that, you know, theology is speaking to the human experience, that psychology is a very specific kind of mentalization model of thinking about the human experience. And then certainly the emergence of neurobiology helps us look at that more on a physiological, even down to molecular level. But there's still so much resonance that exists within these three. Kind of the layer that I want to unpack here from an addiction perspective is the heart beliefs, trauma-informed beliefs, and fear-love circuits. Really what we're talking about here is the limbic system, where it's pre-verbal, it's developing at a time when there's not even access to language. It really is memories. So if you've studied any church philosophy, like early church history, a Thomist perspective would call it passive intellect, that there's something in our bodies that's carried as emotional awareness and understanding about God, about ourselves, about others. But this idea of passive intellect comes to mind, and it's how our brains are working early on, which should come as no surprise. The primary function of that is to foster connection, to foster a sense of bonding. And yet, over time, especially in this critical developmental window that we see in human development from birth till about age 4, it's the place where so many injuries are incurred. Abandonment injuries, abuse injuries tend to start here, even sexual abuse injuries. That these heart beliefs, this kind of passive, understanding, reflexive way of implicitly intuiting one's way through the world becomes distorted, right? And we lay the foundation for what I spoke to earlier with Romans chapter 7, where we have these reflexes that are instantly disengaging from the other because there's a history of woundedness, right? Pat Carnes would say it shows up in more cognitive beliefs, like no one will love me as I am, right? I'm a bad, unworthy person, which is more of kind of this cerebral way of interpreting that experience that's being had on an implicit level. I'm bad, right? And Patrick, you've kind of alluded to tonight, kind of this dynamic of shame that's interspersed throughout our conversation, but we haven't kind of called our attention to that specifically. I would say one of those heart beliefs that can take root early because of the developmental space that's happening there about the goodness of oneself or deficiency or defectiveness of oneself, that one of those heart beliefs that undergirds our experience of addiction is absolutely shame. We see it back in Genesis quite evidently, that there's this covering and hiding with shame. Right? Like they covered themselves and they hid, is what scripture says about this moment of kind of awakening to the reality of good and evil upon eating the apple. That these heart beliefs, right? Like that shame is implicit, shame is reflexive, and it's born out of these wounds that are incurred in the process of development, most specifically with primary attachment figures. So when you hear me talking about kind of the family of origin and the wounds that happen there and their role in addiction, could be from really rigid family systems. It could be from really disengaged. It could be from a family system where one day there's no rules and then there's crazy punishment, even though yesterday there was no rules. Yeah, there you go. Point number 1 on this slide. That there's, in that developmental period, what gets internalized is one sense of deficiency, right? So it should come as no surprise that scripturally, right, we see this idea of shame introduced early because of how powerful of an emotional experience it is and how powerful of a driver it is in the context of addiction. So shame is implicit. It is pre-verbal. It starts early and can be enhanced and reinforced early. Oftentimes it is rooted in experiences of intermittent abandonment, unpredictability of when a parent is going to be present or not present. But it becomes kind of this heart belief, this expectation about who I am, and kind of a map for not only understanding oneself, but how one integrates into other relationships over time. Patrick, could I have you go back to the concentric model slide? So with psychology, that heart belief level is met with trauma-informed beliefs. I think trauma is something that, again, we want to pretend doesn't happen. We want to pretend that it doesn't have an impact on us. But if I can kind of peel back some harsh realities, 1 in 3 young women, 1 in 5 young men are going to be sexually abused by the time they're 18 years old. It could be a date rape. It could be molestation by a peer. Could be an adult abuser as a child. That's 33% of women and 20% of men.
Wow.
Right. And just take that into the pew, right? Like leaders, pastors, what percentage of folks in your congregation is that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not talking about diagnosing everybody with PTSD, but if we're talking about these trauma-formed beliefs that operate, as Patrick mentioned, on this heart level, that part of the resultant impact of trauma on our neurophysiology, which we're going to get here in just a second with fear and love circuits, is really about how we love ourselves, how we connect to ourselves, how we healthily nurture ourselves and entrust ourselves to trustworthy people. Some of these heart beliefs are, if I'm bad, I'll just trust myself to anyone. So with these trauma-formed beliefs, I'm bad, I'm unlovable, I'm worthless, I'm dirty, I'm trash. I've heard a lot in my years as a therapist of how trauma leaves people. Physiologically, where trauma leaves us is having a hard time moving our relational experiences into logical meaning making. So even when someone is loving us well, we can't translate it in a traumatized brain. We can't translate healthy, appropriate love into an experience of, wow, this trauma-informed belief, this heart belief that I've carried is untrue because the connection I'm receiving in real time is altering it.
Yeah.
I just will go to Hosea and Gomer to highlight this principle biblically. How often does Hosea have to pursue Gomer, not just on the metaphorical level as God pursuing his people, but in a legitimate way, that physically as a human being, flesh and blood, human being in a relationship with Gomer, that she was unresponsive to this perfect love that she was being shown, right? Like that's a trauma-informed belief that operates theologically on this heart belief level about unlovability.
Yeah.
And when we feel unloved, we do things, right? Medicating the wound, right?
Yeah.
Now you hear the function language. It served a function. Like she didn't just go do that because what she knew. It's what she knew because it served a function. And it met a heart belief and a trauma-informed belief. Now, these fear-love circuits that we're talking about. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Let me inject here. One of the things that just blew me away as I was in the certification program about trauma and addiction was that all addiction is rooted in an intimacy disorder. It is a fear-based thing. So, you're right now talking about how shame, I'm not enough, I'm not valuable, I'm trash, no matter what I do, it's not going to make me acceptable. It's interesting because, like you said in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, they are naked, and the Genesis chapter 2 says they were naked and they were not
unashamed. That's right.
Then you go to chapter 3, and when they violate that with God, the very first thing that happens upon their shame when they hide themselves is they're afraid. But fear is actually finding its energy around this shame trauma circuit. And then we read in 1 John that perfect love, the experience of it, intimacy, cast out fear. So when I think it's so important for us to come back to realize that all maladaptive behavior, all compulsivity, all addiction is driven from fear that can only be resolved through intimacy, reconciliation, or restoration. So I just thought that was so amazing to consider. When I think about anybody I'm working with in addiction, it's an intimacy disorder. So now then back to you, pick up what you were saying.
Yeah, no, well, you're a step ahead of me because that's where I'm getting ready to go is perfect love drives out fear. But thanks for bringing in, again, shame, because I think it's imperative for us to address. When we think about shame, I think we have to recognize that shame really is a fear-driven response. Right? I mean, you mentioned the amygdala earlier. They serve the function of fear detection, right? There's no other structures in the brain that serve such an exclusive focus tied to an emotion like the amygdala and fear, right? So we have to recognize that shame, even though we talk about it as a primary emotion, really is probably an amalgam of conscious processing maybe projected, discussed, but really it's fear of what's happening in the relationship. And then fear of what does it mean if I'm deficient or defective in some way. So fear, again, becomes a critical driver. How that interfaces with the passage you just mentioned, not just on a theological or psychological level, but here in the green rectangle with looking at fear and love circuits, really we're talking about, in 2015, it might have been 2016, you got to forgive my memory here. They actually found that there's oxytocin receptors on the amygdala. What does that mean? Oxytocin is a bonding neuropeptide. It's a calming neuropeptide. It means we're safe, we're engaged, we're being comforted. So when we say something like perfect love drives out fear from a theological perspective, we could take that in the attachment literature psychologically, but I want you to hear that there's such a perfect convergence point that even on the neurophysiological level, that it took us until 2015 or 16 to identify that there's receptor sites for this primary neuropeptide of calming and connection that serves the function of turning off the amygdala. Oxytocin is produced in relationship where there's trust, where there's familiarity, where there's close proximity, where there's listening and repeating back what's heard, where there's eye-to-eye contact, where there's skin-to-skin contact, where there's touching and stroking of hair, right? Like we're talking about parents and children and husbands and wives.
It's so good.
That level of connectivity awakens in our neurophysiology a response, a perfect love response that drives out fear. It's the reason we scream for mom and dad when we scrape our knee. It's a reason that soldiers in the battlefield, when they're shot and dying, are crying out for their mom.
Yeah, yeah.
It drives out fear.
Mm.
And that's what we're talking about. When we're looking at the question, who, right? Who will rescue me from this body of death? I've met with many an individual struggling with addiction where they ask that question, who? Right? Thanks be to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Right? That in him, that perfect love is there. And I think that's what we're called to as pastors, as leaders, as therapists, as supporting members of a group of one another in Celebrate Recovery or SA or NA or AA, wherever a fellowship is at that one is in, that we strive to live into that same perfect love that Christ himself demonstrated. And it's in that space of not fear driving our behavior, but being loved, that we awaken neurochemically these corrective experiences. Neuroplasticity, right? How the brain changes itself. If there's a testimony to grace anywhere in our bodies, it's found in our neuroplasticity. The fact that traumatized brains can heal.
Yeah.
Drug-addicted brains can heal. Is there some damage that persists, especially in the brainstem and limbic system? Sure. We just looked at that slide. There's consequences. Sometimes there's physiological consequences. There's scarring that occurs. But isn't it beautiful that our Lord himself uses his scars to tell a story? Isn't it beautiful that in our neurophysiology, other parts will begin to compensate for the scarring that's happened? That we can borrow in relationship from one another to ground ourselves, that especially in the context of marriage, that over time, secure attachment enables our brains to borrow capacities from a securely attached partner so that the deficits that we carry are compensated for in the coupleship that's carried forward.
Yeah.
It's incredible, y'all.
Yeah, it is incredible.
And I think it's easy for us, I think, to get lost in the hopelessness of addiction. If I hear anything in people's stories, it's that sense of hopelessness. Things are never going to change. There's nothing I can do. I've tried everything. And I'm here to tell you that there is something that can be done, right? I think it gets back to getting into this level of our process. What are our fear and love circuits? What are our trauma-formed beliefs? What are our heart beliefs? How do those posture us reflexively, instinctively, subconsciously to orient in relationship in a way that perpetuates the struggle, when actually what we're being called to is to engage in relationships where there's the speaking of truth, where there's the allowing of consequences, where there's the administration of grace, where there's the meeting someone in the sand, right? It shouldn't be lost on us that Christ doesn't stand over the woman caught in adultery. He gets down on her level. And as far as we know, he's the only man in the story that gets down on her level and looks at her in the eye.
Yeah.
Like that's the kind of relationship that we're talking about being called into and seeking out. And that's what defines a good relationship with a therapist. That's what defines a healthy sponsor. That's what defines an effective group. When that qualitative sense of connection, that qualitative sense of being known and being seen and being valued in spite of our shame, in spite of our brokenness, in spite of our pain, in spite of our past, that someone can say, as C.S. Lewis said, me too.
Yeah.
And friendship can begin in the context of two people saying me too.
That's so good. That's so good.
And then in that space, we can delve into modifying the narratives about ourselves that we carry, addressing the experiences of shame, addressing these heart beliefs that predispose us to engaging the same pattern of behavior because it serves a function, rewriting these trauma-formed beliefs about how we experience ourselves and how other people are going to experience us, and unlocking the full measure of lovability that we're created with.
So good. Let me quickly kind of wrap up a couple of ideas. Dr. Bowman went through several childhood drivers, from rigid, disengaged family systems, abandonment, emotionally enmeshed parenting, history of trauma and abuse. All of these are things that, for you to become wholehearted and healthy, to be able to take the powers that have been driving you and to now then disempower them, you're going to have to process these things in your brain and meet them with intimacy. And so what we want to do at Red Ink Revival is provide for you an amazing opportunity. And this is actually next Monday night. It's called a personal discovery experience. If you struggle with addiction, or if you want to watch and be trained in how to actually begin working with people who struggle, we would love for you to join us. It's a 2-hour event with Dr. Bowman and myself, so you'll get two professionals. It'll be a 2-hour event, and if you'll use the code PDE for Personal Discovery Experience 50, you can get a 50% discount for having watched this webinar. It is, again, 2 hours. You get 2 professionals, and understand that therapists and psychologists can get $150 plus. Some, if you're in California or New York, you'll get $300 an hour for one person. So you have an opportunity to experience some things. It's interactive. We cap it at 20 people. If you desire to be on, we would love for you to join us. You are going to have to register. And so if you go to redinkrevival.com, look for Driven Addictions. It's this coming Monday, 1 week from tonight. And then if somebody's watching this webinar and it's past that date and there's new opportunities for a personal discovery experience, new dates being offered, just because you watch this webinar in the rears, because you go back as pre-work and watch it, you can actually get 50% off, $49 for 2 hours. And the people who experience our personal discovery experiences, they report back that it's been life-changing to them. We would love for you to be able to take that next step with us. We would absolutely love it. Thank you for joining us today. You might be wondering what's next. Consider attending one of our webinars, personal discovery experiences, masterclass experiences, or retreats. Also, subscribe to this podcast at any podcast provider and on YouTube. Go to redinkrevival.com to find out all the unique opportunities to grow your life and leadership. And while you're there, sign up for our e-newsletter that'll hit your inbox the first of each month with a powerful blog post. Everything that we're building is to resource you to be a wholehearted leader. I'd love for you to be a part of our tribe, and I can't wait till our next episode. I'm glad that you're with us today. We'll see you next time.